Tonight, we're going to be talking about both the potential and the limits of philanthropy to produce real change in our city. I'm Zeke Cohen. It's great to be with you. And how you doing, Dr. Buckley?
Hey there, Zeke. Good to be here this evening. I can't believe it's week 7. It feels like we just started.
I don't know. That's right. That's right. But it's good. I love it. I love it.
Me too. Me too. And I'm really looking forward to tonight in particular. I really enjoyed reading Wes's book, so I'm happy to have him tonight. And I think that Karen is amazing. I remember my first time meeting her and just being so taken by her presence and her warmth. And she's super duper smart and knowledgeable. So I'm happy that she's here with us tonight.
Absolutely. And so that for those that don't know, Wes Moore is a award-winning author, served in the military in Afghanistan, now runs Robin Hood Foundation, one of the world's largest poverty-fighting organizations. Just an amazing all-around guy and true spirit. Karen Weber is the Education and Youth Director at Open Society Institute. Before that, she was a principal in Baltimore City Public Schools, and she is truly one of the godmothers of the restorative practices movement within city schools. Again, just want to take a quick moment to welcome everybody. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please share something in the comments, do a watch party, share the Facebook Live feed. It is great to see everybody. We also want to briefly thank our sponsors, T. Rowe Price and the Family Tree, and really welcome our entire Healing City family tonight.
That's it. All right. Well, I am ready to get started.
Let's do it. All right, let's bring on our illustrious guests.
Hello.
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 Hey.
So again, although they need no introduction, I am really excited and honored to welcome my friends, Karen Weber, who is the Education Director at Open Society Institute, where she has advanced an enormous body of work in our city related to restorative practices. And she comes from a place of having done the work as a principal in Baltimore City, tremendous advocate for children. Karen, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. And Wes, Baltimorean, needs no introduction, hit it big with the other Wes Moore, I believe his first book. But before that, grew up most of his life in our city, went to Johns Hopkins, served in, correct me if I'm wrong, Afghanistan, came back, did some banking and finance, went on to run a college, a youth serving organization helping young people, first generation young people get to and through college here in Baltimore, has written some amazing books. His latest is 5 Days, which chronicles the 5 days after the death of Freddie Gray and the uprising in Baltimore. And it's just an incredibly important read for anyone who wants to understand this city and the pain that we've been through. So Wes, it is great to have you here with us today. Should also mention, he is also the director of the Robin Hood Foundation, one of the world's largest poverty fighting foundations as well.
It's great to be with you, man. It's great to be with all y'all. Real honor. Thank you.
Thank you. And so tonight we wanted to start with a scene from your book, Wes, from 5 Days, where just to set the scene for our audience, this is after the death of Freddie Gray. And as we all know, Freddie Gray died as the result of a tragic rough ride in police custody. This was in 2015. And it was very clear in that moment that something big was happening in Baltimore, that a young person had died as a result of being in police custody. Felt like this big moment for our city. I remember some of that night as well. But Wes paints this picture of being there at Freddie's funeral, and really vivid, and I thought just thoughtful way sort of describes being in this space with all of the big civic and political leaders in Baltimore, everybody coming together to collectively mourn and ritualize the death of Freddie Gray, but having this feeling of, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but guilt and almost cheapness. And the word that you use ultimately is complicity, that here are all these important people rallying together in this young man's death, but where were they in his life? Yeah. And why is it that Freddie was allowed to grow up lead paint poisoned in deteriorating public housing, that he was actually swindled out of his lead poisoning settlement, that so many systems had colluded to produce such a poor outcome for this young man and for so many young people across our city. And this really beautiful and sort of wistful scene that Wes paints of feeling emotionally conflicted about where were we for Freddie before his death, and how many other Freddies are out there right now who could use all of this energy. And so, Wes, we want to start by turning it to you to think about that moment and think about what it would mean for a city like Baltimore and all of its richness and complicated messiness. What would it look like if we truly cared about the Freddies of our city before they died in police custody and in a horrific way?
It's well, first, Zeke, thank you, man. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for not just bringing us together on tonight, but just your repeated way of bringing us together. And to Melissa and the Karen, it's a real pleasure to be with y'all, sincerely. And you're right, Zeke. I thought deeply about it, and I think the best word to describe the feeling that I was sitting there, and then when I left, was this word complicity. And it's the word that sat with me because that was the first funeral that I ever attended of a person that I did not know in life. And I felt like that was part of the problem, is that probably the vast majority of people who were there at that funeral had never known Freddie when Freddie could speak to us and actually hear what he would tell us. And if you look at so much of his life, if you look at so much of the 25 years prior, before he made that final contact with police and he was killed in police custody, it was one of these things where we spent tremendous amount of time thinking about what happened in those minutes. We spent a tremendous amount of time trying to answer the question, what happens when a young man makes eye contact with police? And by the way, I point that out because only in neighborhoods like Freddie's neighborhood is that a crime, right? Where you can literally make eye contact and run, and that's enough to trigger a probable cause. That's not the case in Guilford. That's not the case in Roland Park. You can't make eye contact with law enforcement and run and get triggered for probable cause in Roland Park. It doesn't work like that. Or in Homeland. But it does work like that in Harlem Park. It does work like that in Sandtown, Winchester. So he makes eye contact, and an hour later, he's in a coma. And so much of the conversation really drives around this idea of, well, what happened then? But it really does. It forces us to ask the question, what happened for 25 years? Why do we have a young man who was born premature and underweight, that was born addicted to heroin, because his mother battled addiction, the disease of addiction, for much of her life. The fact that she never made it to high school, she could not read nor write. The fact that Freddie then does move into a house that in 2009 is cited in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead, where the CDC indicates that 6 microbes of lead in every deciliter of blood is enough to give a person cognitive damage for the rest of their life. Freddie Gray had 36. And so what does it mean for the fact that arguably the most peaceful week of Freddie's life was the week that he was in a coma? Because that week, at least, he was surrounded by doctors and nurses. That week, at least, he was surrounded by activists and lawyers. That week, the entire city knew his name. That week, the entire city cared whether he lived or died. Name a single week in his life for 25 years where all of those things would have been true. And to your point, Zeke, the heartbreaking thing is it really does, and still does, actually ask us to drill into the question of, if we know that that is a reality for so many of our children, we know that is a reality for so many of our families, we know that we still have a system that have policies that are putting people and keeping people in poverty and then blaming them for their being impoverished. If we know we still have systems and frameworks within our society, then I think, as someone once said to me, which I thought was really appropriate, they said, you cannot mourn the micro unless you're willing to do something about the macro. Because until we do that, until we can get out of this point of mourning the micro and ignoring the macro, then we're just going to keep on going through this process. And so when I talked about the idea of complicity, it wasn't something that we need to look at and say we need to blame this person or that person or this institution or that institution or this elected official, whatever. It means all of us. Because in every single way, we are supporting a system that is killing our children. And that becomes on all of us to be able to really take an honest evaluation of everything that we do. And how then do we think about the structures and the systems and the pieces that we want to put in place that actually can create, a place where opportunity and ambition can actually meet each other, and where all of our kids actually have a shot, because Freddie Gray did not.
Wow. My heart is racing, because when you put it that way, that was the most peaceful period in his life. That is an incredible tragedy.
Yes.
And a profound injustice.
Yes.
And, you mentioned poverty, and obviously we know that is one of the glaring problems that confronted Freddie and the Freddie Grays of Baltimore City. I'm a social work professor, and so in one of the courses that I teach, we talk about poverty extensively. And there is a philosopher, if you will, Rank, who says that poverty is an injustice because it can be prevented. What are your thoughts about that with respect to Freddie and Baltimore City? And talk to us about, what does that look like to prevent poverty?
Poverty can be prevented because poverty is created. It's one of these things where, when I hear people make an argument, they say, well, poverty is a choice. And my answer is, it is. But it's not the choice of the people who suffer under its effects. It's society's choice. Society has made a devil's bargain as to how much pain we are willing to tolerate in our neighbors, as long as it doesn't impact us. The problem with poverty isn't just that it's there. The problem with poverty is that it is consistent, it's predictable, it's oftentimes generational. That we're talking about an institution that funnels people in. If you take a look at even the impacts of what's happened with COVID-19, and we look at the amount of people that have now been thrusted into poverty due to the impacts of COVID-19, here's the reality. 23% of people who have lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were in poverty before COVID-19. So think about what I just said. 23% of people who have lost their jobs were in poverty before COVID-19, i.e. this was the working poor. These were people who were working jobs, in many cases, multiple jobs, and still living below the poverty line. How do we have a society that we can have people who are working, in many cases, a full-time job and are still living below the poverty line? How do we have a society where we now have 5.6 million people who are now newly uninsured? And it's really because we have a healthcare system that in many ways relies completely on the employment system. And so when we lose 11 years of job growth in 11 weeks, which we have just seen in the process of this country, you now have close to 6 million people who are now newly uninsured and who are just begging and praying not to get sick. How do we have a system where everything from, you know, the realities that we see right now are still very much remnants of the histories that we have had baked in? And where we can have a system that when you look at a 10-to-1 wealth divide, when you're looking, I mean, when we're talking about poverty, we're not talking about just certain people work harder and certain people don't. We're talking about systems being put in place that make a rise unbelievably difficult, if not impossible. And this goes back actually to this idea of complicity, where, you know, oftentimes they will talk about individual success stories, including mine, where they will talk about, well, he did it. And we'll talk about that as if this is like, so if a person happens to transfer or transition, that we say it's because of them. But then the inverse then also must be true. Then if a person doesn't make it, then that's also because of them.
You know, let me just jump in.
Can I jump in too? I want to jump in really quickly.
Go right ahead.
No,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Karen. You got it.
As we start talking about the macro and systems that are in place, I think what becomes critical is to define what those systems look like and what the trends are that create the system of poverty. Poverty in and of itself has not handicapped us in the way that we are experiencing now. And one of the things that I did, for example, when I was in the school system, is look at the poverty that I saw among the children that I taught and that I was the principal of and eventually the executive director of, and think about the poverty that my parents experienced. There was no safety net when my parents came along in the rural South. So what was it about this poverty that created this cycle of poverty and violence that wasn't evident in the rural South? And I'll tell you what is evident in urbanization is over-policing and mass incarceration. If every young person is going to jail, they are coming out of jail and they are learning to be violent and bringing that home. And that goes into the schoolhouse, that goes sometimes into the job place, it goes like a virus. So the virus that we see in COVID, we have to think of violence in the same way. And until we begin to unpack the systems that create violence, we're going to be hamstrung. And we're going to be just talking in circles and not getting to the root of the problem. So the first thing that has to be done is to see what is the root of this problem. Yeah. And I would say that our current law enforcement system, our criminal justice system, is what keeps us in a state of poverty and also keeps the cycle of violence in motion. So 1 or 2 or 3 people escape from the cycle of poverty, and then they get away as far as they can because they don't want to continue to live through the trauma and subject their children to that. And guess what? It's not their job to bring the entire community along. In the 70s and the 60s, people were saying, you know, oh, you've left your community. You should uplift your community. They didn't create this system of violence. They didn't create the policing, the over-policing that goes on in the community. And they can't be expected. Individuals can't be expected to make those changes. That's what we have to do as a society. And I'll just say that we're in a rare moment in Baltimore City, where we have some newly elected people or soon to be newly elected people who are in line with much of the advocacy that we see happening out in the streets. And they're very much aware of the public health implications of violence as an epidemic. And we have the opportunity to treat that together, to treat this system of violence together as a collective. We can't do it without government. We can't do it without advocacy. Philanthropy has its place in there as well. And if we're all working in concert, I think we're going to see some huge movements. Zeke, I just want to applaud you on the Healing Cities Act. It's amazing. It gives us the language, the verbiage, and also the umbrella we need to work under. And I think that as we come together around these notions and this understanding of how we've gotten to where we are, we can begin to undo it.
Amen.
Man, and Karen, I want to pick up from that point and hone in a little bit on some of your work. Having been a principal in Baltimore City, there is no way to do that job without directly confronting the impact of poverty and systemic racism in all of its forms, whether the criminal justice system, housing, educational inequities that still persist. But as you transition, as you became part of this philanthropy world, joining Open Society Institute and attempting to bridge and rebuild some systems, I'm interested in your work because, we're in this moment right now where there's a rallying cry around defund. Right? People are referring to the police department and what you said before about sort of the criminalization of Black and brown people, whether through the war on drugs, mass incarceration, any of the ways in which we criminalized poverty and criminalized communities of color. There's now this loud and important call for us to defund and rethink and reimagine public safety. But you've been doing work in this space and sort of laying a blueprint for what that could look like since way before the most recent uprising in Baltimore, or way before the tragic death of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. Tell us about the restorative practices movement, restorative justice, what that means in the context of a place like Baltimore, where, to your point, we do see this insidious, profound school to prison pipeline where suspensions, expulsions, and then incarceration had been, and still to some extent still are, but we've seen some real improvement, but had been so normalized within our school system. What does it mean to be restorative? And talk a little bit about the work that you've been able to seed and lead here in Baltimore.
So cut me off if I keep talking, okay? Because when I start talking about restorative practices, I sort of have a lot to say. One of the things that we saw some 12, 13 years ago is that 26,000 children a year were being suspended and put out of school. Now we know for a fact that when children are suspended at that level, they're in harm's way. There's not necessarily someone at home who's gonna, bake cookies and do homework with them. They're left to the place where they've come from, which is often impoverished and violent and dangerous. So 26,000 children a year being turned out into the street on a regular basis, sometimes for things as ridiculous as the student talked back to me, and out they go for 10 days. Come back into school, have no idea where we are in class, especially math class, at least for me. And now they act up again, and the recidivism continues. And so that is a child who is prone to drop out and also prone to be set up for involvement in the criminal or juvenile justice system. So that's the syndrome. So what can we do? Well, suspensions are something we decide as adults to impart on children. Is there another way? Of course there's another way. What we found is that in schools where the majority of students are white, restorative mindsets are in play. The browner the school becomes, the more likely the punishment will be zero tolerance, harsh punishment that leads children straight to the jailhouse. And there's an expectation that goes along with it that you children will never be anything. So if that is how you feel anyway, if you somewhat dehumanize the circumstances that the children find themselves in, and you don't really fully believe that they can be successful, you really don't mind putting them out. By the same token, we know that in Black and brown schools, there's an excessive use of school policing. we know that that leads directly to arrest. What I will say that is in Baltimore, some 6 years ago, 7 years ago, arrests were about 1,000 a year, 1,000 children per year being arrested and coming out with a record. I want to lift the name of Akil Ham, who, when he came on board, he and I worked together. And I do want to say that I worked at the district for 3 years. And that's where I saw the overview of what was happening regarding the relationship between the justice system, the school system, what we thought we were doing to help children and send a message, and what it was actually doing to them. But when Akil Ham came on board, he gave me a phone call and he said, look, this is not how I want to do policing. And I recommended highly restorative practices and other de-escalation techniques. Holistic Life came in and did mindfulness. We went from 1,000 a year. The last full school year, there were 50 arrests. And they were primarily for really serious crimes, bodily harm, having weaponry, and I mean serious weaponry. I don't mean a steak knife, I mean a gun. So we've come a long way. And I think the most important thing, and the reason I'm sort of going on about this, is that this is replicable. This is not an anomaly. If you can do it in Baltimore, you can do it anywhere. The one other thing I want to add is what happened with restorative practice. It was something that I learned as a teacher. And quite frankly, I wasn't the best teacher in the world the first year. I was like, what am I dealing with? I had no idea what I was doing. You're thrown in, you do the best you can. But then I learned restorative practices. And then I started to understand where my kids were coming from, it switched the whole universe. It's like, you guys are the ones who are important. I'm learning from you as much as you're learning from me. By bringing that level of humanity into the classroom, you reduce all kinds of isms, classism, racism, sexism, homophobia, because the people in front of you become little people that just need your guidance and your words to get them to the next level. I took that idea and that understanding of restorative practices and built it into everything I did from there on, and began to seed it a little bit when I was at central office, but people didn't have an appetite for it at that time. Since then, there are so many organizations working on this, the Positive School Center, a group called ACOBIN, and they've gone into schools, they've trained and coached. You can't just do a 2-day training and walk away and say, good luck, I hope this works for you. You've got to be there periodically to help do the problem solving to make sure that this is going well. What I want to say about the first cohort of schools under Dr. Santelises' direction that went through this restorative practices approach with training and coaching, a 44% reduction in out-of-school arrests in a 1-year period. So 44% reduction in suspension. And we know that the combination of the reduction in arrests, the reduction in suspensions, begins to stem the school to prison pipeline. It can be done. We want to see it replicated. We want to see it expanded.
Trying to write notes as you were talking. So did I understand you correctly? You said that it went from 1,000 suspensions?
No, I'm sorry. So it was 26,000 some years ago down, and it's down now to around 5,000, 6,000. But in terms of arrests, it went from 1,000 arrests a year for any number of petty issues, and it was 50 during our last school year. So from 1,000 down to 50. And Akil Ham himself, who speaks to different audiences, because he's much more convincing than I am to a law enforcement group. And what he'll say is that he attributes restorative practices to this big decline. It switched the officer's role from being facilitative or from being punitive to being facilitative. And what I heard from school police, because what I'll say too is that we wrote a report and we spoke to some 400 stakeholders. And school police were talking about, like, they didn't buy into this. They thought it was, nonsense. But when they started to use the practice in schools, they had kids coming up to them saying, look, something is about to go down. You really need to become involved. And they said they've never been brought in like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it is transformative. It can make the difference. But we just have to, we have to stop being so punitive as a society in general, and especially as it pertains to Black and brown children.
Most certainly. And I think that to your point, that at the core of this issue is humanity. And until we start seeing Black children as children, we're going to continue to have these really high numbers of arrests and suspensions in our schools. And so, because the overarching issue here is poverty, I want to sort of pivot back to you, Wes, if you could. So Freddie Gray, we don't know what his school records were like, right? But if we were to assume, based on what Karen just shared with us, talk to us about how the poverty really shows up in the everyday experiences of children in Baltimore City schools, and how does that sort of bump up against the judicial system?
It's one of these things where actually you can see, even from what we do know about Freddie's school records, you see how poverty is interlaced in everything. The fact that he was in developmental and special education classes his entire academic career because of lead poisoning, right? Because of the fact that because of the damage, the cognitive damage that was done by the time that he was 2 years old, that already we knew his academic trajectory was going to be altered because of that. We do know the fact that his last recorded day in Baltimore City schools was in the 10th grade, and he was 19 years old, right? So these are things that we do know about him and his academic career. The things that we do know is that, when people say that we have a school to prison pipeline, that actually isn't quite accurate. We have a poverty to prison pipeline. We have a pipeline where, it's not that all schools are sending kids into prisons and kids who are incarcerated. It's kids that have to who are attending schools in impoverished areas that we are ripping resources away from. Areas where even when we have bills, even when we have legislation that gives opportunities for students to be able to benefit, like the current legislation that came up last year, how for some reason when we have no money for it at that point, but we can find $2 trillion to find when necessary. And so this is the type of thing that when we're talking about decisions that are being made and who the decisions are being made to benefit and who the decisions are being made to exclude. And so when we're talking about how does poverty show itself, you bring up a really important point and a really important question, Melissa, because the answer is it shows itself in every way.
That's right.
It shows itself in the water you are drinking. It shows itself in the air you are breathing. It shows itself in the schools you are attending. It shows itself in the way you are policed. It shows itself in every single facet of your life. Every waking moment is a reminder that you live in poverty. And so that's how we see this thing manifest itself in just some really damaging and frankly very predictably horrific ways for so many of our kids.
Yeah, and to pick up from there, Wes, I think about both of you and the work that you do. So you run one of the biggest poverty fighting organizations in the world. Karen, you're at Open Society Institute, part of Open Society Foundations, the George Soros's big global foundation. I think a lot about the role of philanthropy, particularly in a city like Baltimore, where one of the unspoken truths about much of the philanthropy in our town is that it is ill-gotten money. And by that, I mean, much of it came from really predatory lending practices and discriminatory housing and banking. And so the money itself that fuels philanthropy in Baltimore is complicated. The history of where the money came from in Baltimore is complicated. And Wes, you talked about complicity in this sort of the role that we all play. One of the other complicated dynamics that I see, and I know, Karen, we've had this conversation, and Wes, is I think that philanthropy can be a form of catalyst, that it can seed, that it can spark innovation, that it can, in its best self, partner and lubricate relationships, and get institutions to the table, and get the school system to start paying a little more attention to restorative practices, or get the city government to adopt a different way of thinking about criminal justice. But it can also, in its worst self, I think, subvert democracy and become this charity. Let's give out a few coins so that a few kids can go to college and hopefully end up like Wes Moore, while not acknowledging the systems that are colluding to create the other Wes Moore, which is a reference from Wes's first book, where Wes, who you're looking at, obviously ends up very successful. The other Wes Moore ends up in federal prison after murdering a few people. And I think that to me is the worst aspect, the most dysfunctional aspect, and that there is this system wherein we can, instead of doing democracy, we can end up doing charity and not connect systems, not rally together, and that it can become this whole other thing. I'm curious, in your work, both of you, how you see this dynamic at play, how you see the potential for philanthropy to catalyze, support social movements, support community organizing, support small d democracy, versus when it can, in some ways, subvert democracy and become just a whole nother thing. I guess maybe start with you, Karen, because I know you've got thoughts on this topic, and then I want to go to Wes. But what do you see? Because I think you've been successful at embedding your work within systems and not just feeling this need to like reinvent the wheel, create this whole new thing, but like being good at knowing how to bring folks to the table in a way that's quiet and humble and thoughtful, but impactful.
Well, thank you for calling me quiet and humble and thoughtful. I'm going to take that with me today. I guess what I'll say is, who's sitting at the table? Who is at the foundation calling the shot? And if you're not a participant in the movement, then you may be complicit in representing the system over and over again, replicating the same system that exists, and believing in exceptionalism. Like the really smart Black kids are going to make it. And the others, well, it's not their fault they were born in the wrong zip code. So I think some people have really good intention, but they lack experience. They haven't been in the quote unquote trenches. They haven't done the deep dive in terms of the analysis of the problem so that they can see how to fix it. The other thing that is problematic to me, I came out of the school system where the budget was $1.3 billion. And so here we are with, let's say we have $1 million to do 10 different projects. What I don't understand is when philanthropy overblows its influence. It thinks that this $200,000 that I'm giving you should make you do what I want you to do. And it's just absurdity. The other thing I'll say in terms of experience is that before I did anything in education, I was the executive director of the Public Justice Center. So I've done systemic discrimination type issues lifelong. So it prepared me to be in this seat and see from many different angles, as a lawyer, as an educator, as a what and a what and a what. If I just got out of grad school and I got thrown into this position, there's no way that I would have the experiential level needed to look at complex problems and begin to unpack them with a certain level of empathy for all people involved. Because if you villainize anyone, they can't come to the table with you. And they are part of fixing the problem. So I don't know if that answers your question quite, but I also am just going to say very blatantly that having Wes, my director, Danielle Terrain, having me in the seat as people who are African American, serving African American people, there is a difference because we have lived experience that you can't really emulate if you haven't had that experience. And I'm not saying that, oh, everyone in philanthropy who serves African Americans should be African American, but there needs to be voices at the table who can do the translation and say, wait a minute, folks, this is what you're not getting quite right. Listen to me. I have power in this arena, and I must speak. And I have to be able to influence what we're doing here because we're not going the right way.
I agree with that. In addition, before you speak, Wes, but it's, representation matters. And so it's really important that the population served sees themselves at the table, because otherwise they're not going to really trust that this organization is really here to help them and respects them and those sorts of things. So yeah, you got to have Black folks at the table.
And we have to make sure that we're also supporting organizations that are led by people who are part of the community as well. I mean, around 10% of philanthropic dollars right now go to organizations that are led by people of color, which is staggering when you consider not just the amount and the size of organizations, but also the need, and that there is so little support and reliance for organizations that are led by people of color. But first I just want to say, amen to Karen's point, and I echo it all. And you're right. I mean, I try to pride myself when people say, that you run a charity, and I said, no, I do not. I run a change organization. I don't believe in charity. I believe charity is paternalistic. And I believe charity is wrongheaded. And oftentimes, if you believe in this concept of charity, your altruism will be viewed as something else.
Yes, indeed.
And so to stand in partnership with, with Karen, with Danielle, with leaders in this field, that's a really big deal, because I believe they approach this work, and we try to approach this work again, not as a charity, but as a change organization. And when I think about the role of philanthropy, Zeke, you said a really important word, and that's humility, where our work can be catalytic. Some of the proudest investments that we have made, frankly, are things we don't invest in anymore because we don't have to, right? Where you think about the history of Robin Hood, it was actually us and OS and Open Society who were some of the first to invest in things like needle exchanges. And we did it in a time when that was a very controversial thing. No one wanted to, what do you mean you're going to give away clean needles? It's like, well, the data is showing us that actually that one of the fastest growing trends for the spread of HIV/AIDS was people who were exchanging needles. So we actually believe that exchanging of clean needles can actually decrease the spread. Well, now Robin Hood doesn't invest in needle exchanges. Neither does Open Society. Nobody does. The reason is because the federal government does it. But they were never going to be first money in, right? First money in was going to be philanthropy, who was able to say, we can take bets and we can take punts that maybe city officials, state officials, federal officials can't, because you're dealing with public dollars. And we get that. And so let us come in and take the punts. We can be catalytic. We are focusing on investments right now where, frankly, our responsibility and the lens that I use is not how do we create a line item for an organization for the next 20 years. The question becomes, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And if we can provide capital or management assistance support or technical support to say that we can make this problem history in 5 years, 7 years, eventually present it to government, scale up the problem, fix the problem, then that is the definition of success. And I'll close with this, where it's like, we think about, when we talk about the humility that's necessary, the number fluctuates a little bit, but on average, every single year, about $700 billion goes towards philanthropy every year. And people are like, wow, that's a big number. And it is a big number. But here's the reality. Half of that goes to colleges and universities. Half of that goes to alma maters. It's the reason why Harvard's endowment is $30 billion, right? So we're not talking about 700 billion. Now we're at 350. So people say, well, 350 is still a lot of money. True. Half of that goes to hospitals and homes of worship. So now you're not even talking about 350. You're talking about 175 now. And that goes to everything else. That goes to the environment. That goes to veterans issues. That goes to early childhood. That goes to poverty. That goes to animals. That goes to cleaning the bay. $175 billion goes to everything else. So we in the world of philanthropy have got to be humble. Humble about the fact that our resources are important, our resources can be catalytic, our resources can de-risk things, our resources, and that our powerful and most tangible use is actually not necessarily the capital we put out, it's our voice. It's the fact that if we were to speak out on issues, if we were to speak out on things, if we were to speak out on the work that we see, if we were to, and I think, Karen led out incredibly well, if you're not working with community, then you are not serving the community, period. But that's where we can have outsized power. And I think that oftentimes the narrative that it's just about the philanthropic purse, that's the thing that's making the big difference. Again, I'm a very data-driven leader. I believe in numbers. I believe numbers should help and shape how we think about this. The numbers don't back that up. The most powerful thing that we can do is not just be smart about the capital, but the most powerful thing that we can do is use our voice, because people should pay attention and people will listen.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it does, it is heartening that you both and Danielle are so deep in this work. And there really has been something of a sea change in Baltimore in terms of leadership in the foundation community. Because I remember even a few years ago, to your point, Wes, there was a vote that we had to take, really probably the hardest vote I've taken in my very short political life, was on a 1-year mandatory minimum for illegal gun possession, right? And, this was at a time when violence was off the hook. People were getting robbed left and right. And it wasn't just happening in Black Baltimore. It was also in my neighborhoods in Southeast Baltimore. It was happening throughout the White L. There was a lot of armed robbery and carjackings. And then Mayor Pugh said, you know what, we need to get the guns off the street. We need to get the people who are using the guns. We need to get them off of our streets, and we need a 1-year timeout. There's a 1-year mandatory minimum. And I remember, in my mind, first talking to my former students about what does this mean to you? When you hear mandatory minimum for guns, what does that sound like? And then talking to Dan Webster over at Hopkins, who's one of our nation's foremost experts on gun violence, and can, to Wes's point, look up the data and can, back up whether this is going to work or not, right? Will this actually reduce violence? And what both my students and Daniel Webster said is, no, evidence isn't there. And what my students said is, they're not going to be coming into Canton looking for people's guns. They're going to be in Sandtown pulling guns off of people. And given that we just had all this horrific fallout from the Gun Trace Task Force, why would we possibly do that? We're not in a space where we should. And I remember myself, Councilman Burnett, Snead, a bunch of us getting together and saying, all right, we're going to take a tough vote on this. We're going to do the right thing. We're going to do the evidence-based thing. We're going to say no. And we're going to hope that people stand with us. And I will say, at the time, it was disappointing because there was a deafening silence among folks who knew better, folks in the sort of Baltimore academic left, nonprofit foundation. No one wanted to say, you know what, that's inappropriate. That's not the response that we're going to look to. Yes, we are in epidemic levels of violence in our city, but we've tried that already. Mass incarceration simply does not and did not work, and it produced exactly what we now find ourselves in. We're not going to do that again. And so I do think having you all at the table and setting the table and supporting the table and building the table, I think is so important, because your leadership matters, and because we need folks in all these fields. And I think this is part of your work, Wes. We need folks at every level that are bold enough to say, we're not going to do the same foolish thing again and again and again because it appeases some people and it feels easy and it feels safe and it feels like it'll make us safe. We're not going to do that. So I'm glad to have, sort of what you both said in terms of the role of philanthropy is not just the purse strings, it's not just the dollars, but it's the advocacy, and it's being able to take the risk on the needle exchange or the restorative practices, even when that's not the popular thing to do.
Right. That's exactly right. And that honestly, I think that just comes back to something we all have to get comfortable with, because that's also what leadership entails. If you're worried about having 100% approval on everything you do, don't ever plan on assuming a leadership position of any form, because it just doesn't work like that. I mean, I wake up every morning, Zeke, you wake up every morning, Karen, Melissa, we all wake up every morning knowing that on a good day, on a great day, actually, 60% of the people are going to love what you just decided. On a great day, you hit 65%, you're doing backflips, right? But you're going to go into your day knowing that by definition of taking these roles and taking these responsibilities and working on issues that are hard, and we know they're hard because they're still issues, right? The easy stuff has all been figured out. Knowing that there are going to be people that are going to disapprove with the decisions that you make, with the things that you say, and being okay with it. And part of the way I know I'm okay every night is I never forget who I'm making decisions for. I never forget the community. I never forget that the people that I'm making decisions that I think are in the best interest of the people who I am sworn to, not just in terms of my job occupation, but in terms of my moral compass, that I'm sworn to protect. And if that's the case, then if your decision might not be popular, like the vote at that point, then so be it. I will still get my sleep tonight because I know I made the decision for the right reason. And
I'll tell you, they were ready to run me out in that moment. But guess what? I got 67% in my life.
That's past backflips.
Karen, jump in there.
No, I'm just co-signing.
Oh, okay. All righty. Well, we are unfortunately nearing the end of our time together. But I think that what you just said, Wes, is such a powerful way for us to end this. Never forget the community. That is the driving force here. That is the message that we want folks to walk away from this with. That sometimes, the work that we're doing, it's not going to be popular. We may not always have the support, but we must remember who we are working for. And it's not for each other. It's not for accolades, but it's for the people who are sometimes voiceless, the people that do not have a seat at the table, the people that need us to advocate for them and to speak up for them. We must never forget the community.
That's right. Amen.
We thank you so much for your time with us this evening. Thank you for your work and for your commitment and for your realness, your authenticity. And just thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
You. Bless you. Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.
Appreciate both of you, and Dr. Buckley, always, always, always great.
It is my pleasure.